Look, I share the same concerns that nearly everyone has with AI. Transhumanism, smart cities, the singularity. And the irony is not lost on me that right now we have humans doing the work and robots doing art, which is the opposite of the utopian idea that was pushed on us in the past. So when you mix the Bible with AI, people understandably get kind of twitchy with it. Now, I'm not asking our potential future robot overlords to do exegesis for me. I'm employing AI to help me write code for some tools that I'm working on. And I've been playing around with this stuff in the background for a while now. But in my ongoing study with Mark, it's become really relevant. So I figured I'd let you guys in on some of the things that I've been working on. Now, there's so many AI tools out there that are freely available. Of course, nothing is really free.
You offer it to me freely.
With social media, your data, you are the product. But in this case, I'm not exactly worried because China isn't really getting my information here. They're getting a bunch of biblical analysis. Worst case scenario is we get Lieutenant Data saved. No pun intended.
Say Christ is Lord.
Thank you, sir. I will.
Now, the app I employed to help write this code is from chat.z.ai, and I'll put a link down below, of course. And I suppose you could ask this particular chatbot for keto recipes and things like that, but that's not exactly what the service is. This is more about writing code. Now, one of these apps I want to make available, but I'm not sure exactly how to do that because I don't have a website or whatever to host it on. The other app will have to go behind Patreon, Ko-Fi, just because of the nature of the material it's interacting with, the information. It kind of has to go behind a paywall. You'll understand what I mean in a minute. And by the way, the code going off right now on the screen is not just for show. I'm having to rewrite one of these programs because it went offline. That's why I'm a little bit unsure of how exactly to host this so other people can play around with this. But what are we looking at exactly? What are these tools doing? Well, Warren Gage and J. Randy Beck wrote a book called The Surprising Case for the Longer Ending of Mark. The title speaks for itself. And it's this beautiful book right here. I'm just kidding. It's not. It's a PDF. This is just some random book. Now, how they argue for the longer ending of Mark is really interesting because they do so on a literary level, specifically what they call delta form patterns. Now, if you've followed biblical studies at all, you've come across the idea of chiasms, which is based on the Greek letter chi, which is like an English X. It's a narrative format. So take the flood of Noah, for example. The narrative opens with Noah, then it introduces his sons, then it mentions the ark, then it mentions the flood, then the covenant with Noah, etc., through the rest of the narrative. Now, note the oddity of the fact that it introduces the ark and the building of the ark before it even mentions the flood. That's a little odd, but that detail actually might make a little more sense when we consider the narrative mirror that the chiasm produces. Because when we look at the end, moving backwards, we end with Noah, the mention of Noah's sons who went forth from the ark, and we're told there will be no flood in the future, and God's covenant will be with all humanity or with all of creation. These patterns are all over the Bible. In fact, the entire Bible, you could argue, is a giant chiasm because it begins with creation, and you have the Garden of Eden, you have the Tree of Life there. At the very end of Revelation, you have a new heavens, new earth, new creation, the New Jerusalem, and you have the Tree of Life there. And this book is going to argue for a specific kind of chiasm, what they call delta form patterns. And as they write on page 9 of their book, textual parallels appear within the gospel at roughly equal distances from the pivot verse. I realize that's a little dense. So in other words, what it's saying is that you have a verse that kind of serves as a hub. And then if you map out equidistantly, you find these textual and thematic parallels. So for instance, you have hub verse here of, let's say, like 9:7. And then if you look 15 verses before, 15 verses after, you're going to have these parallels, either in vocabulary or thematically. And so that's basically what I'm doing here. That's what these apps are looking at. And so let's just go ahead and take a look at the apps themselves. Now we're still waiting for it to write some code. I should point out, by the way, I didn't really talk about the website itself. One of the things you have to note is at a certain point, again, it's basically free, but at a certain point, the chat will exceed its limit and it'll tell you to start a new chat. I'm not sure if there's a way to continue what you've been doing. So what I've been doing is I find kind of a stopping point and then I save all the code into a text file, whatever. And then I start a new chat and say, based off of this code, and then I continue the project. That's what I did with these apps. So you're going to see like this motion background, stuff like that. That's something I had made before. I just randomly had made that code. And so I told it to use that code for the background. And the same's true for like the Bible app itself, like the calculator app. And again, we'll see here in a moment what that looks like. So here are both of these apps. Well, this is one of them. The other one's over here. This one's a little bit more practical, I suppose. And this is the one I would like to make publicly available if I can. This one over here is a bit more visual, although in many ways, visually, this is depicting a lot of the information in the book. So that's why I don't want to make this one public exactly. Now, by the way, there's like a light mode, there's a dark mode. Now, here's what we're looking at. We're looking at every connection in the Gospel of Mark, or not necessarily every connection, but we're looking at these delta patterns where we have each of these patterns here up to 29 are like hub verses that I'll just pick one at random. We looked at this one a little bit. So this is 9-7, but they are mapped mathematically, equidistantly from this pivot verse. And this is true throughout. All of these other patterns do the same thing. Now, what's very interesting about what they noticed is the fact that so many of these patterns, in fact, I already know because I've already looked at this stuff. These two patterns and this one right here, these are the only ones that do not touch the longer ending. You can see this purple area is the longer ending, although there might be a little bit of a visual bug because of the scaling. So for instance, if I show you one of these, so there's 3 connecting into the longer ending, but in reality, there's these 2. So 4 looks like it's connecting, but it actually shouldn't be. So visually, there's a bug. I haven't debugged that yet. But the point is, all of these patterns, with the exception of these 3, are touching into the longer ending. I mean, look at how it's practically just completely lit up because some of these patterns are ending in the longer ending. That seems to argue very powerfully for the longer ending to be authentic. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at some of this. So let's kind of combine both of these apps here. So we're going to look at this. So here we are with the other app. Now, this one defaults to just showing these verses, which is the baptism here in the center, and then over here, this is the transfiguration, which they're thematically linked because in the baptism, you have John the Baptist baptizing Jesus, and Jesus comes out of the water. The heavens are torn open. That's important. Spirit descending on him like a dove. A voice came out of heaven. You are my beloved son. With you, I am well pleased. 320 verses after this is 9-7, the transfiguration. A cloud overshadows them. A voice came out of heaven, or came out of the cloud. This is my beloved son. Listen to him. Now, right now, the first verse you put in is the pivot verse. So right now it's saying from 110 to 9-7 is 320 verses. But currently, because 110 is the pivot verse, it's looking 320 verses backwards. Of course, there's nothing there. So if I swap and then run it again, now it's looking 320 verses in front of 9-7, which is this over here. Jesus uttered a loud cry, breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn. It was ripped in 2. So giant inclusio from the baptism to the crucifixion. And then when the centurion sees all of this, he says, truly, this man was the Son of God. So we have the baptism, the divine confession that Jesus is the Son, and then you have, at the very end, you have the human confession. But mathematically, they are 320 verses from this center of 9-7, where out of heaven or out of the cloud, there's a voice that says, this is my beloved son, listen to him. Let's go ahead and do pattern 3 with 9-14 as the example that I want to show how this works, because this one actually does touch into the longer ending as well. And in fact, goes from the beginning, verse 1. So 9:14, and we'll go 3:19. By the way, 9:14 is when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and the scribes arguing with them. Now, 245 verses back. 3:19, we have, and Judas Iscariot who betrayed him. 245 verses after the pivot verse of 9:14, we have, and immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with them a crowd with swords and clubs, so on and so forth. So the actual act of betraying is 245 verses. So here we have that announcement that he's going to be the betrayer, mathematically equidistant from each other. We have the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. In 1461 over here we have, and Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. This is 311 verses from the pivot. And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, and came out of him. 1537, and Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. How about 1:9? In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. 16:7, but go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. And the last of these is verse 1, beginning of Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. On the other end, go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation. Again, that's 16:15. That's well into the longer ending. We could continue doing this one after the other with these different patterns, but I think you kind of already are getting the point here. By the way, here are the controls that I made. I mentioned this earlier. This was done off of some previous work, so we can change the controls to make things however we want to make this look. We can increase the count, decrease the count, size, minimum, maximum size, movement speed. We can make it much faster. The draw distance between the lines. It's a good example of, I think, how you should approach this insofar as you should say, hey, I've made this previous code. I want to implement that code together in conjunction with this other stuff. And by the way, on this screen right now is one of my favorites. So we have a pivot verse of 8:27. This one is when Jesus says to his disciples, this is at Caesarea Philippi, very theologically pregnant location. He asked the disciples, who do the people say that I am? 288 verses before this, we have 124. What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And so that is an unclean spirit confessing the identity of Jesus. Well, 288 verses after the pivot of 8:27, we have them asking the high priest, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming with the clouds of heaven. Now, this one here, to my knowledge, does not have other connecting verses in this hub point. So this one's a little bit of an odd duck because, like I said, it doesn't have other connections. But thematically, these are really tightly connected and very interesting. But I think with this one, it's worth the caveat that something you need to, I think, understand about what's going on with the delta patterning and stuff like that. You could always take two vocabulary terms or ideas or something like that, find those 2 points, and then calculate a midpoint between them. Because you could always have anything. You could always cut something in half. And that doesn't make it relevant, though. So that's important. Just because you can find 2 points and then half it does not make that important. That doesn't make it a delta pattern. So really what it's about is finding these hub points where you have a number of connections connecting back to it. That's what makes it so impressive, is that you have these patterns that have just a number of connecting points with it. That one, though, is kind of unique in that it seems to only connect those 3 passages. As far as I can tell, I haven't looked. I know that there are other kind of confessions, other encounters with demoniacs and things like that. So maybe it's worth looking at those and seeing if there's any other hits. Because, and this is a point that they make in the book, that notice how backloaded this is. Starting really at 8, that's where the hub verses begin. And it's heavily weighted to the second half of the gospel as opposed to the first half. What exactly that means, I'm not entirely sure. But I don't know, perhaps there are more connecting points within here as well that just haven't been discovered. But that would require more investigation, which I'm not opposed to doing, especially with the app itself. It's pretty easy to kind of check some of this stuff out. By the way, I did notice every now and then I'll come across a something in the book that, for instance, let's say they said it was 287 verses, and my calculator says 288. So sometimes I wonder. I would have to go and like count by hand. I'm not saying that that happened in this case. I don't know in this case. You could check your work pretty quickly with something like this. But so I like some of these that are really far apart because I think that's when you really, really see the pattern. Pattern 4, which is 9:18, is the pivot verse. 1:8 is I have baptized you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. 333 verses from the pivot verse, and then 333 verses forward. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. Again, we could keep going one after the other. And this stuff is, to me, it's very persuasive, really impressive. I want to, in the future, do the other synoptic gospels as well as Revelation, the kind of calculator thing. Again, I understand that people are a little bit hesitant about AI and things like that. I completely get it, completely understand. But right now, if we think creatively, I do think that we can use these kinds of technologies in service of the kingdom. I think if we're just creative enough, I'm not asking it to do exegesis. I'm not telling it to solve some theological problem for me. I'm using it as a tool. And if we think creatively about this stuff, I think we can get some really interesting results. And I have so many ideas about how I could continue using this kind of stuff in different ways. And I hope that this inspires some of you to kind of rethink maybe some of this. And yeah, that's all I got for this time. And I will see you guys later.